Oh, wow. I have never heard that before. Welcome, everyone. Gonna just get things started in one moment. Okay, we'll give it a moment for everybody to come on in today. I'm gonna pop into the chat. If you need our captioning services today, just click on the link that I've just put into the chat box. So we are excited to have you join us today. This is our last Teen Science Cafe in our spring series. And for summer, we're actually leaving the computers behind and we're going to be in person. So it's really exciting. So I would just want to introduce myself. I am Lauren Traster. I'm the 4-H Teen and Leadership Program Coordinator here at UVM Extension. And Sage knows what's to do. Sage from Maine, welcome. So if everyone can find the chat box, we love to start our Teen Science Cafes, just having everybody say who they are and where they're from. I see Simon and Jack are with us again from Montpelier. Would love to see who else is joining us today. So go find your chat and introduce yourself. It'd be nice to see. I know we have more than just 2 people. Hi, Cosimo and Wisteria. Nice that you guys are joining us again. And Knight's back from Derby. Amy and Allison are right around the corner from me in Morrisville. Ella's with us from Lyndonville. Great. Cosimo, we're going to have you hold your questions for a moment. But Laura, if you can see, we're already getting started on a baby bird on the ground. So you are going to learn what you can do.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things I will go over for sure.
So I think you guys are going to learn a lot today. So keep introducing yourselves in the chat box. I'm just going to remind everybody when we are here in Zoom, you are all muted, but it doesn't mean that we don't want you to speak. We definitely want you to engage with our presenter and with one another. So you're going to share your thoughts and answer questions that Laura has for you in the chat box. And that's how we use the chat box. Your questions for Laura are going to be put in the Q&A box. So we use the chat and the Q&A very differently because Laura might not be able to get to your question right away, but she will get to it. So the Q&A kind of holds all the questions outside of the chat box so they don't get lost. So be courteous to one another. Don't create any distractions, which again, really the only way is in the chat box. So just make sure you use the chat box appropriately. This is going to be a really interesting topic today, so I know that you'll be engaged. Participate. When the presenter asks you questions, please respond. It's way more fun for everyone if a lot of people give responses and just creates a much richer experience for everyone. So before we jump into today's presentation, I do want to remind everyone that we do have some in-person programs this summer. So we're going to be doing Summer of Science, and there is a whole host of workshops from geology to herpetology to virology to plant science to rocketry and a bunch of others that you could sign up for. They're free, and you can learn more about those workshops at the website that's listed on this slide. And we are also having the Natural Resource Management Academy. This is something we do every summer. We've changed it slightly this summer. It's normally an overnight program, but we're not really able to do that this summer. So it's just a one-day program when we do it in partnership with Vermont Fish and Wildlife out at their Green Mountain Conservation Camp. And if you're interested in natural resource management, we bring in 4 different presenters, kind of like we do for Teen Science Cafes. And so there's a different workshop and you'll rotate between all 4 workshops throughout the day. We're going to feed you lunch and dinner. We're going to play some games. It's going to be really fun. So hopefully some of you might want to join us for that. So let's get to today's presentation. I'm really excited. Today, we're going to learn about tales from a wild emergency room, rehabilitating wild birds of prey and other critters. Our presenter is Laura Hatmaker. And let me just tell you a little bit about Laura's background. Laura was an apprentice wildlife rehabilitator and intern for years at City Wildlife in Washington, D.C. and Owl Moon Raptor Center in Boyd's, Maryland. As an apprentice, she assisted master rehabilitators and veterinarians with emergency care of patients ranging from baby opossums to snapping turtles to bald eagles and everything in between. She moved to Vermont in June of last year, where she is pursuing her second master's degree at UVM in the field naturalist program. There, she's continuing to explore the natural world around her and contribute to its protection and conservation. And in addition to being a wildlife lover and a closet bird nerd, her words, not mine, she is a budding botanist, emerging entomologist, and a herpetofauna hunter. And her dearest wish is to one day be like Gerard Durrell and help improve standards and best practices for conservation and cultivation of wildlife and wild places. So let's all welcome Laura to our Teen Science Cafe. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to get to interact with everyone and, get started. So I'm going to share my screen. And we'll get started. So my name is Laura Hatmaker, and I'm a field naturalist candidate for a master's at University of Vermont. And I have been an apprentice wildlife rehabilitator, as well as intern and volunteer for many years prior. So 2-minute bio about me. I don't actually, before becoming a wildlife apprentice and volunteer, I was not a typical science person. I got my bachelor's in archaeology from the University of Mary Washington, and my other master's is in Latin. And I actually taught Latin for a very long time at a variety of different schools, and more recently English and then biology. I started as a nature enthusiast and animal lover, and then started volunteering at City Wildlife, where I was able to get to know the wild creatures a little bit better that were living nearby me. After a year of that, I started becoming an apprentice and registered with the Maryland board, and then started an internship at Owl Moon in Boyd's, Maryland, where I focused more on wild birds of prey, which were kind of my passion project. That led to me becoming more and more involved and wanting to do this as more than just a volunteer aspect. So I started taking evening classes at the University of Maryland, and everything from ecology to biology, chemistry, ornithology, a lot of different things. And then as a result of that, I started applying to graduate schools for round 2 and was accepted at UVM's Field Naturalist program this past fall and started. So that's kind of a little bit about me. But first, I want to ask you guys a question. So what is a wildlife rehabilitator? What do you guys think a wildlife rehabilitator might be? What do you think who might they be? What might their background be? And just as a reminder, you guys can type your responses in the chat and I'll see them.
There's always a delay while they're typing away. So hopefully somebody is actively typing what they think a wildlife or who is a wildlife rehabilitator. Amy wrote biology.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of them are biologists of some kind or ecologists. A lot of them also are environmental science professions that are, getting back into more local things. So definitely all of them love animals and all want to make sure that they are safe in their wild homes. That was Gabby who said there's someone who loves animals and helps them find homes and make sure they're safe.
Oh, so Simon and Jack both said, when we were on vacation once, a baby osprey was found in the water and a kayaker put it on our dock. It was there for an hour or two before someone came to put the osprey back where it came from on its home island.
Yeah, that happens when they fall in. Osprey are water birds, so they do dive into the water, but sometimes if they're feathers get a little backlogged, they can have difficulty getting back out. But normally when that happens, we try to get them onto dry land sooner rather than later. But you guys are all on the right track. A lot of people say that wildlife rehabilitators, because they work with wildlife and people equate them with vets, that a lot of them are vets, but actually most of them are not licensed vets. A lot of them are vet techs, or they have veterinary experience from being on the job, but most of them work with veterinarians rather than being licensed vets themselves. Often they're volunteers, meaning they're not really getting paid a lot of money to do what they do, but some are able to turn it into at least making ends meet with a nonprofit organization. And they are always trained in husbandry, which is the care of wild animals on the day-to-day, like what do you feed certain animals, because they don't, of course, eat dog and cat food all the time. Then also, of course, they're trained in physical therapy, not like human physical therapy, but if an eagle has a broken wing, how do you get it back to being able to fly after that? Just like you have to go to physical therapy after you have a severe injury. So they're trained in that as well. They get trained in triage, so what to do when something comes in that is very injured and how to immediately care for it and get it back to a stable position. They're trained in vet tech basics, so anything from giving an IV or subcutaneous or under the skin fluids, to administering medicines, being able to help assist a vet with giving them anesthesia for x-rays or surgery. Some of them are, of course, trained in doing more advanced techniques, like trying to do surgeries and smaller surgeries and things like that. But so a variety of different skills there, and of course species specific needs, because what works for an owl isn't going to work for a snapping turtle. So a lot of knowledge rests within them. So why do you guys think wildlife rehabilitators might do what they do? And I think we already kind of touched on that a little bit, but what are some things that you think might drive a wildlife rehabilitator, and why is wildlife rehab something that's important?
Oh, Laura, I'm going to back up for a second. Gabby wanted to know what kind of bird was in the picture that you
Oh,
just had.
I believe, if I remember correctly, that is a great horned owl.
Okay. And in the future, Gabby, questions like that, you can just pop into the chat quickly, because that's something we could try to answer right away.
So if you can see where the nest is, put it back in the nest, Cosimo. That would be the very first thing that I would do. If I found a baby bird on the ground, I would put it back in its nest if I could safely. So wildlife rehab would be, the reasons we do this is because we care for the natural world. We also want to make sure that the human impact that it does happen on nature is lessened, so that we're not doing as much damage to the environment. We also want to improve biodiversity, meaning we just want the natural world to be as rich and diverse as possible. We don't want to just see one species hopping around. We want to see the full range, because each of them have small jobs that help out every aspect of the environment, even if you don't necessarily realize it just on looking. And of course, the main one that we talked about, love of animals, and they need help. So wanting to help them, as Gabby said. So what are some tasks of a wildlife rehabilitator? So one of the main things that we do as a wildlife rehabilitator is, of course, take care of injured animals. And in the case of baby birds, you definitely can touch them and put them back in the nest. That's a myth that the parents will leave them, will abandon them. You can definitely pick it up. So that one I will dispel right away for you, Danita. So a wildlife rehabilitator has a variety of different tasks. So I'm going to kind of go through a series of stories and scenarios so that you guys can kind of understand the breadth of what we do, but also so that you can participate a little bit more in trying to think and figure out what would you do in certain scenarios, like finding a baby bird on the ground. So our first story is about a bunch of little opossums. And so this is a Virginia opossum that is on my arm right now. It's a baby, about 5 weeks right now. So it's one of the marsupials that you can find. So marsupials are animals that give birth to live young, but the young are underdeveloped and have to live in a pouch. We only have one species that's native to North America, and that is the opossum. But they don't just have really cool ways of raising their young. They also are really great for the environment in terms of cleaning up things, but also getting rid of pests that can be nuisances to not only us, but other wildlife like ticks. They're omnivores, so they eat pretty much anything that is food. So vegetables, or carnivore or herbivore, they're equal lover of both. And as I said, they're scavengers, so they are part of nature's cleanup crew and just making sure that larger things are broken down more quickly and then returned to, what microorganisms can deal with more readily in their scat, which is a fun way, or a professional naturalist way of saying they can't harbor rabies, which is also pretty cool. Like a lot of scavengers, they have adaptations to help them in their variety of foods that they eat to not get sick. And one of those is they have a very low body temperature, which means that rabies and many other pathogens actually can't survive within their system. It's really kind of cool how well they're adapted to that. So these opossum babies came to us after their mother had been in an unfortunate incident with some other humans. A bystander was able to stop what they were doing and bring her to care. But unfortunately, their mother didn't make it. She died of her injuries, but her 6 babies were able to be cared for, and they were all healthy. They were not injured in the process, which was good for them. But as a wildlife rehabilitator, we can't just release them right back into the wild because they were too young. So a lot of wildlife rehabilitation is actually caring for creatures who are orphaned at an age and can't be released into the wild yet. So part of that is feeding them, and housing them, making sure that they're safe and cared for, and when necessary, putting them in the care of adults of their same species, so that they can be a little bit more prepared to go out into the real world. This is more long-term care because they'll be here, like these possums would have stayed with us for at least a month and a half before we would have been able to release them. And if it was near winter when we had them, then we would have had to wait until winter was over and summer returns. So when we do have baby animals, those do need to actually wait until they're old enough to be able to survive in the wild as a young adult. So these guys were all raised and successfully released. And luckily and when we do work with them, which is an important point, we try not to socialize with them a lot. It's very brisk to business. In the case of opossums, you feed them and then put them right back. They're not visual imprinters, so they don't necessarily look at humans and identify you as a food source. Some animals do, but opossums are not one of them. So to that, we have our first scenario. You find a furry baby squirrel out of its nest on the ground. What should you do? Definitely sage if you can find the nest and it's within reach, because a lot of squirrels tend to nest pretty high up in the trees, so not always safe for you to climb up and return it. But if it's in a easily reachable area, you can pick them up and put them back in their nest. I would recommend wearing gloves just because they might have, fleas and things like that. And you don't necessarily want to have fleas on your skin, but you can just put them back if you don't have access to gloves right then and there. So that's always the best response. And Gabby kind of echoed that and said, put on plastic gloves and back in its nest. And so did Emily. So those are great responses, because if they're furred, they're not in immediate danger too, but there is another thing that you can do, which is to kind of just watch them from a far distance. Like if they're in a park, maybe be a good 100 feet away from it and just kind of see what happens. When they're furred, they are possibly being knocked out because of a storm, or they could have fallen out because they're starting to crawl around and mama squirrel has to go pick them up. And she does, but she won't do it if you're standing right next to them, because while they don't care if you've touched them, they don't want to be there if you're there. They're still a little skittish of humans. So the best thing, if they're furred especially, is just kind of to back off, let them be, watch them from a distance. And if you see them, eventually the mama squirrel will come down, pick them up in her mouth and return them to the nest. That she'll do it herself if the nest isn't accessible to you. Another thing is, if you do notice that the squirrel hasn't been picked up after a while, like a period of over 5 hours. So it does take a long time sometimes, but if after 5 hours they're still sitting on the ground, then, and you're starting to think that they're in immediate danger, perhaps you see a cat nearby that's not on a leash. Not that a cat would normally be on a leash, but but also dogs too, anything that might predate upon it, then it is necessary to remove them from that location and take them to a local rehabilitator. But usually the best course of action is to try to put it back in the nest. And if you can't do that, to wait for mama squirrel to come down and pick them up and return them to the nest. This happens a lot during baby squirrel season, where we have people inadvertently kidnap them, thinking that they're in trouble when they're not. So great responses, guys. So the second story I have for you is about a bald eagle. This bald eagle was found just as you see in this far picture, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Actually, let me turn it into a laser pointer. Can you guys see that? Awesome. So this is a bald eagle that was found on somebody's back porch in this position. So they thought it was dead, but when they walked up to it, they found it was still breathing. So of course they wanted to help it. They called the local wildlife rehabilitation, which was Al Moon. So this is a story from them. And what happened is Al Moon didn't have staff to help out immediately. So we actually worked with the Humane Society to bring them in. So this eagle, even though it's on the ground and looks knocked out, is still potentially able to hurt you. What you need to watch out for are the claws or the talons, not so much the beak. The talons are its business end. But usually what we ask people to do if we can't go out immediately is to try to put a quilt or a towel over the bird so that it is, one, it can calm down and it will be protected from the sun so it won't dehydrate further necessarily. But also it makes it easier for animal rescuers to come get them. If they're subdued enough to the point where they're not thrashing around, then they're picked up and you can put them in a box and take them to your nearest rehabilitator. But only, of course, if you are comfortable and not going to injure yourself, because your own safety is first and foremost priority. So this bald eagle was found and brought to us by the Humane Society, and they helped. At first, he looked really, really bad. He had no visible injuries, so he had not been attacked. He hadn't been hit by a car. What had happened, we suspected, was poisoning. And this is very common in birds of prey, especially ones that will scavenge, even more so. We suspected lead poisoning at first, which is most common in bald eagles because they tend to go after hunted kills, or they can also get poisoned by fish that they eat that have concentrations of lead in their system from unclean waterways. So we at first thought that was the issue. So we started doing just hydrating the eagle, trying to flush the toxin out of its system, because that's one of the best things. There's another process that you do for lead poisoning, but we had to wait for toxicology results to start that process, just because it can be a little caustic to them. Um, so once we got the toxicology results back, we found it wasn't lead poisoning. And so that was, I guess, a plus, but we still didn't know what was causing the issue. And the upside, though, is the eagle was responding to its rehydration and perking up. And in fact, it only took 3 days for it to be pretty feisty in its cage and want out. On the 4th day, we were able to take it out and do creance flight training, which is what's going on here, where you'd put the bird on a line and you have jesses, which are small leather bands that go around the raptor's talons, and they fly out, but you pull the line gently as they fly so they can land at the end of the line and aren't jerked down. It's a way to see if a bird is strong enough to be released into the wild, or if there are any issues, like if they're favoring one side versus the other, or if they're not able to get enough lift because their feathers are damaged, things like that. So he did really well in his flight training. So we took him back and decided to do some imping, which is a procedure to take feathers from a donor eagle, which would have been an eagle that did not make it, but his feathers were harvested in an effort to give another eagle a better chance at living. So we used feathers from an eagle that had not made it to help this eagle fly a little bit better because his wings had been damaged in his foray with dealing with the poison and possibly other things. So once his flight feathers had been replaced through this process of kind of inserting other feathers, then we were able to release him on the 5th day, which was a wonderful success story for him. This eagle, we did learn, probably had been poisoned by phenobarbital, which is commonly used for euthanasia. This toxin, in being used for euthanasia, still lives inside whatever organism that ingested it for that purpose. This usually might have been maybe a farm animal that was euthanized for one reason or another, and then left to decay out in a back pasture, which, while being against the law, is not uncommon. So it's why it's important to always make sure that either not to use poisons, if at all possible, when you're doing pest control, or if you do have an animal euthanized for whatever reason, that they're well out of the reach of wildlife. Because inadvertently, not only do you poison the creature that you're trying to get rid of, but then also perhaps the thing that's feeding on it as well, and which you are not intending to poison. So this eagle was successfully released, which was a really positive thing within 5 days. It's a great healing process for him. So now I have my second scenario for you. So this time we have a great horned owl, which we have pictured here, outside at 11 a.m. in your backyard, and it's perched on the ground. What do you do? Okay, I got a couple of responses. Alice says to watch it for a while and see what it does. Emily says to stay away from it. Amy says nothing. Well, definitely don't approach it necessarily. But a great horned owl, when are they active? When are owls active? At night, yes. Sage and Emily, you are right, and Shivani. So if an owl is outside at 11 a.m., that is not normal for an owl. So for it to be outside at 11 a.m. is warning bell number 1 for me as a wildlife rehabilitator. Warning bell number 2 is that it's perched on the ground. Owls, raptors in general, aren't on the ground unless they have caught something just then. And then they're going to usually fly back up to a perch to feed. So they don't usually stay on the ground at all. So a great horned owl on the ground during the day, Alice, you're right, it's probably sick. So if that's the instance, you probably should call your local wildlife rehabilitator as soon as possible, because that is something that needs immediate care and attention. You have something that's, one, not supposed to be on the ground, and two, not out during its normal time. So, and birds are not rabies vector species, so they're not acting out of some weird viral mechanism. So definitely probably sick and probably a case of poisoning. So that is probably something that needs immediate help. So good thoughts, guys. So next we have our third story, which is another thing that we as wildlife rehabilitators do. And that is to contribute to science that's around the area. So in addition to helping injured and orphaned wildlife, we also try to contribute back to the scientific community by helping monitor local populations. So one of the things I was able to do was help band baby kestrels as part of a monitoring station that we were going through in Boyd's, Maryland. So American kestrels are small birds of prey, and you can see one pictured in this corner right here. He's a very small little guy, but they're about this big. They're very colorful, and they like to hunt, especially in open fields. So you'll often see them perched on power lines. And in fact, what we did was we created nest boxes for them and put them in various areas in abandoned fields where there would be a lot of prey for them. They like voles or small rodents. That's their favorite favorite prey. And what we would do is, once chicks had hatched and were of a certain age, we usually waited for about 3 to 4 weeks, but we tried to go into the nest and then band them, which is we take a metal band that's an alloy of like steel, and we put it around their leg, leaving enough room for their leg to fully grow and expand. And then that way, if the bird is found at any other point, whether it's observed by another biologist or it becomes injured, or if it is in a nest in and of itself, we can trace back that history and find out where that bird came from and how long it's been around, because they get banded as babies. So it helps conservationists monitor a population, and it also helps rehabbers keep track of their past patients, because every patient we get, we also then band before its release so that it can be kept track of. It's a way of seeing how a population is doing. If you have a lot of individuals that are banded from Maryland but end up somewhere in Pennsylvania, it tells you about their movements. It also tells us if they're successfully breeding and how many from a certain clutch are able to successfully breed. So it gives us an idea about mortality as well for the local area. So our next one is the next scenario, where you have a mostly feathered baby bird out of its nest on the ground. What do you do? Yes, you can call us, definitely, Shabani. You stage, yes, you should probably watch it if you can for a while to make sure it's okay. And Amy Walker, yeah, definitely you could put it back in its nest. Emily, yes. Alice, definitely check and see if the bird, that nest on the ground, that's an important one. So, and Gabby, you said watch and see if it is saved by another bird or flies away. So when you see a baby bird, first assessing how well is it feathered? Like, are we talking like a baby bird that looks pretty much like a bird? Or is it still kind of half naked? Well, if it's looking more like a bird than a nestling, which are usually pretty bare and fluffy, so they look kind of like a little bit more skin than they do feathers. If you see that, then it's probably fallen out of the nest. So the skin and feathers, little fluff feathers, those want to go back into the nest or onto the nest, whether it's a ground nester or a tree nester or a bush nester. There's many different ways that birds like to nest. So looking around and kind of trying to see what's going on is helpful. Like seagulls, they just like little scrapes on the ground, and that's a nest to them. Little hole in the ground, that's perfect. But robins, of course, they want to nest in a tree if at all possible. Warblers love to nest in brush. So different birds like to nest in different areas, and you can't always necessarily tell that by the baby itself because it's very hard unless you've studied them pretty well. So if it's mostly feathered and you can figure out a little bit more, you can tell it's a bird and not perhaps some weird alien, but you can tell it's a bird then. You do definitely want to watch and see what's going on because often it's a fledgling and it's fine. It's just learning how to fly. So what happens when birds are young and they've just started to get those wings developed, they want to fly. And so they try and they perch on the edge of their nest, and sometimes they take a jump and they flutter, but they don't have enough strength to get anywhere but the ground. So they kind of land in the ground and they kind of sit there for a little bit as they kind of wait to see what's going on. Their parents will definitely still feed them the entire time, but this is a point in their life where they're learning how to fly. And it's really important to let them learn. So leaving them alone or watching them, and you'll notice that they'll start hopping to different things. They'll start trying to glide just a little bit off the ground to certain things. And some species, in fact, of birds, they'll be even less able to hop or to fly, and they're just literally hopping on the ground. And their parents, that's actually part of their process too. And the parents will feed them on the ground well until they're almost an adult. And this happens especially with owls. There's one species of owl that will feed its young while you would think it would be in trouble, but it's actually part of their process because that's how they learn how to fly, is that young baby owl will just keep floating around until it can get the wing strength to get up into a tree. But the parents feed it the entire time. So when you see a bird on the ground, ask yourself, how is this one learning to fly? And is it a fledgling, or is it a very, very pale skin, mostly skin and little down feathers? The skin and down feathers are the only ones that need to be returned to the nest, and the others are usually just learning to fly. And if it's injured, of course, that's a whole other matter entirely. If you see it's injured, that's when you call us. So if you do, Amy asked a question, like, what if you find a nest that your outdoor cat also found, oh no, on the ground in a flower bed? The baby birds are still in the nest. What is best to do? Well, it depends. If your cat managed to get any in its mouth, then I would bring them in. And the reason for this is because both cats and dogs have bacteria in their mouths that can be really damaging to baby birds if they have any puncture wounds whatsoever. So making sure that, your cat didn't play with them a little bit in their mouth or on their claws, because that's going to lead to an infection which can kill them. But if it just looked at them and you caught him before he did anything, then they should be fine. But yeah, try to keep kitty indoors. But good question. Thanks, Amy. So our next story is about imprinting, which somebody mentioned earlier in the conversation. So Lady Gillis, the black vulture, was one of my favorite birds that we had. She is amazing. And I know a lot of people think vultures are kind of gross, but I think they're amazing birds. So Lady Gillis was brought to us as a young vulture. She had imprinted on the people who had brought her. And so she thought that humans were her tribe. And while that was wonderful and fun to interact with as a rehabilitator, we can't release animals that have been imprinted back into the wild for the very reason of, think about you walking on a hike and all of a sudden a black vulture jumps on your back because he thinks you're your buddy. That wouldn't go over well, not for the vulture and certainly not for you either, because they can also sometimes have very interesting bacteria on them. But they're very intelligent and super interesting creatures, also part of nature's cleanup crew. And they're super intelligent, very, very capable birds and learn very quickly. So as I said, when when an animal comes to us that has been imprinted and they aren't able to return to the wild for those human wildlife conflict reasons, then we do try to make them education birds. And so education birds are those that you see like when you go to a wildlife rescue park or a conservation where they have some animals that they bring out and show you. Those are education animals. They have been, for one reason or the other, they're perfectly healthy, but there might be something that prevents them from succeeding in the wild. Often, like we had one bird, a great horned owl, his name was Wink. He couldn't return to the wild because he was missing an eye. And that's pretty debilitating for a bird of prey, especially for an owl, because you lose that depth perception. And so they can't really hunt for themselves. In Gillis's case, she thought humans were her friends. And while is wonderful for those who are on the same side as Gillis, can be intimidating if she were to randomly try to approach someone who didn't know who she was in the wild. So Gillis became part of our training program for an education bird, and she was then licensed under a wildlife education expert, which is a subdivision of a falconry license that you can get. So Gillis is now in her enclosure in Boyd's, and she is being trained to work for different preservations and conservation events, so that she'll come out and introduce people to what a vulture is, and also make everybody fall in love with her because vultures are amazing. I like Gabby knows already, vultures are amazing. So that is one thing that we also do, is we do help birds and other animals that aren't able to be released in the wild, if they're still healthy individuals, to try and find ways for their life to have meaning and purpose, and also kinship if possible. So here's another scenario for you. A turtle is in the middle of a busy roadway. He's trying to cross the road. What do you do? Very good, Emily. Yes, definitely help him across in the same direction he was facing. Sage, she says, stop traffic, pick it up, put it on the side of the road it was going towards. Emily says the same thing. Cabby says, make sure it is harmless, and if it isn't, help. It's true. If it's a snapping turtle, you might want to be a little more cautious with that. Look and see if it's safe to help it, Shivani says, and that is definitely important too. So the main thing is, yeah, definitely, Jack, keep your hands away from it if it's a snapper, at least the business end. So you definitely all kind of hit it on the head. You want to make sure, one, that you make it sure it's safe for you, because again, busy roadway, you don't want to turn into a pancake yourself. So make sure that, one, you're able to get to the turtle and help it across safely, because if you're not, then your life, well, turtles are amazing and I love them, but your life comes first. So make sure that it's safe. If you have a friend with you, like if they can play interference and let you know when traffic is coming so that you can focus on the turtle, that's great. If it's any turtle, you can help, even a snapper. You just got to be careful. But if it's a snapper, you want to maybe consult with how to pick it up, but usually it's like towards the back, and then you can push it on. If you're concerned it might bite you, you can always use a log or a stick and just kind of push it across. You don't have to use your hands. So that's one thing. You don't always have to use your hands. You can always use a stick or something that's nearby, or if you have like something that can push it along in your car. Just the idea is to get it into the same direction it was going, because if you put it facing the opposite way, as you guys already know, it's just going to go right back into the road trying to get to the other side. So you want to make sure that you get it back in the direction it was going. Oh, Simon once accidentally caught a snapping turtle while fishing. Oh, that's a surprise. Although I've heard, according to some of my friends, that they're good eating, if that's your thing. I can't personally recommend that. So yes, good job, everyone. So my last story also has to deal with measuring conservation efforts and kind of doing public awareness, which is another part of wildlife rehabilitation. And that's bringing knowledge to the public about how our lives as humans can impact wildlife, even in ways we don't necessarily realize. Unlike the bird banding with previously, this one's not as fun in terms of happy, but it's also a really important message. So Lights Out DC is, well, Lights Out in general is a program that is comprised of volunteers that walk roadway or walk city blocks during the early morning hours and survey for birds that have struck windows during the night because of light pollution. So normally birds do this when we're migrating, because the birds migrating are traveling by night and in flocks. And the reason that they're traveling by night and in flocks is because they are trying to avoid predators. And they're of course going very long distances, some coming from, all the way from South America to, Maine and further north. So they have a long journey ahead of them, and they travel by night to avoid predators. And they travel in a flock so that they're all going in the same direction, but also, again, to avoid predators. There's safety in numbers. Birds, when they fly, usually aren't looking necessarily straight ahead. They are paying more attention to their peripheral vision because, again, they're looking out for predators. And part of staying in a flock is also knowing who's to your left and right. When they come into cities and urban areas, or really anything that has tall buildings that are lit at night and are glass so they can see the light, it disorients them, especially when they land and then try to take off again. So what will happen is these birds will strike the windows and they will die and then fall to the ground. So what these volunteers do is they collect these birds and they identify them, and they then report all of this to the local conservation societies and efforts to try to get cities to try to use other methods of lighting or using blinds or doing something to mitigate light pollution during the night and during the migration season. So this was something that we did in DC, but it affects every area worldwide. And in fact, Vermont Audubon has one as well, Lights Out, that program that can be joined too, if that's something that you would be interested in. And this link down here at the bottom, if you're interested in reading more about the program, I will pop to Lauren, who can email out, or you guys can email me about those and other questions. I'll send my email in a chat in a minute. So your fifth scenario and your last one is you're hiking and you decide to take a break and have a snack, and then a pine marten appears from the woods and starts begging. What do you do? By the way, true story. This did happen. Bingo, Sage. You do not feed it. Yeah, Ella, definitely don't feed it. Gabby says, leave it alone. Emily says, just say no. Yep, that's pretty much it. You don't want to feed them. And in fact, you actually kind of want to scare them away, because them approaching a hiker means they've been fed before by humans. And exactly as Alice said, you don't give it food. If it gets food from humans, it's more likely to approach a human next time. And while there's a couple of different reasons you won't want to do this, aside from the fact that giving them food makes them come to more people to have food and they're a nuisance then, but it also, you could end up inadvertently poisoning them or giving them something that makes them sick, and then that lessens their chance of survival. And also, just because you think they're cute doesn't mean the next person they encounter will think that. Some people might get scared I mean, pine martens, while very adorable, they do growl very aggressively for food. So I can say that having been growled at by a pine marten who wanted food. Um, somebody who doesn't know what they're doing might think they're rabid and then try to hurt it. So I think usually we try to avoid habituating wild animals to humans because there is that misunderstanding that can happen. People can think they're sick when they're not. People can make them sick with their food. And then it becomes a cycle where the marten may or other wild animal might become dependent on humans then for food and stop being wild. So that's another reason is we try to keep wildlife wild. So great answers, guys. And yes, Amy, they are so cute. Now, as I kind of alluded to before, not every story turns out as wonderful as some of these do. If you have an adult wild animal that is unable to get away from you, chances are it is very sick and it might be too late for it. But whenever you find an adult animal that is unable to get away, that is a case where it needs help. And so knowing who to call is really important because a lot of people don't. Also knowing that rehabbers don't have unlimited staff, volunteers, and resources. They do have to allocate and prioritize. If they can't get to an animal, they're going to try their best, but anything that you can do to help really helps them out a huge amount. Also, to be wary of thinking a baby animal needs your help because oftentimes they don't. A lot of people will kidnap babies thinking they're helping, and then it actually can put stress on the rehabilitators' resources that aren't necessary because they do require a lot of care and a lot of long-term care. Baby birds have to be fed every hour during the day. So just imagine if you have 90 baby birds all wanting to be fed every hour. You have volunteers just going round the clock feeding baby birds the entire day, and it is exhausting. So knowing that most of the time babies are going to be okay if you can either get them to the nest or just make sure they're in a safe outdoor place for mom to get them. Some people also will unfortunately try to keep babies thinking that they can help them, which sometimes may work out, but a lot of times it doesn't. And that can just, again, cause undue stress or illness to the baby. And a lot of them do come when they do realize they can't take care of them anymore, they do bring them in, and then the baby is unfortunately really sick already. So try not to take care of things yourself. Remember that, mom is always the best solution, wild mama. And then if wild mama is really not an option, then your local wildlife rehabilitator is. But there are also ways that you guys can help. So regularly volunteering is a huge asset. A lot of wildlife rehabilitators need help, but they need help that's consistent. Things that aren't going to do one-day stints. Like they go through a lot of time to train you, and you do get to interact with wildlife. And so they really want you to be dedicated. But if you have that time, lending that time is worth so much to them. Also donating things like towels, paper products, produce, cat and dog food, worms, whatever your local rehabber needs. They usually put up a list on their website of donation items that they need. And those are great ways to help out. Not using poisons or chemicals for pest control. On it, please don't use rodenticide. I have seen way too many owls die from it. Using the mice traps is kinder in the long run. It's maybe not the most pretty, but that is better than poisoning them and then letting them poison others. Keep your cats and dogs leashed and or indoors. I know they get out every now and again, as I have a small little culprit as well that tries to get out, but trying to do our best to keep them inside can help. And also having them wear collars with bells helps birds get away in time. Using blinds or window distractors can help prevent birds from flying into your windows, especially during the summer months when it's hot, especially those of us who are in apartment buildings where we're up a little bit higher than your normal 2-story or 3-story house. That can also be helpful. Also, just talking to other people who you know about what you've learned and doing more outreach events, going banding. Like the banding events that I've done, I've gone to an Osprey banding event, which is what's pictured here, this little guy, where it is a one-day thing. You go and a wildlife rehabilitator and wildlife biologist goes out with you and tells you about the birds, and then you get to help with banding. And it's a great way to get that interaction and that knowledge without some of the more long-term time commitment. Avoid feeding animals on trails and pack in what you pack out so that they're not used to human food scents is really big. Make sure that your compost and food scraps are properly secured and disposed of so that you don't have any unwanted wildlife interactions. And if you do want some that are good for them, then setting up a bat box is a great way to help your local bat population, which is always in need of a hand up. Those little guys, they need so much help. But setting them up a little bat box would be great. And then you can see them in the evening, fly out. Also setting up a bird feeder in your backyard. It might feed more squirrels than it does birds, as is the way of things, but you also do get some really great visitors, especially during migration season, and you can really see the diversity that's in your area. Some local resources for Vermonters. I know there's people from all over, which is exciting, but Vermont Fish and Wildlife is huge. They do more than just hunting and fishing permits. They're in charge of all wildlife that is in the state. Their primary goal is to maintain natural resources. New Hampshire is going to have similar things. I literally Googled wildlife rehabilitators in Vermont and came up with this list. So usually if you just Google your state and wildlife rehabilitators, you'll find if your state Fish and Wildlife doesn't have links to them, there will be a database resource or PDF file that has them. Audubon Vermont runs the Lights Out program, and I believe Audubon runs one for every state. There's also the Vermont Institute of Natural Science, which is a really cool place to volunteer at if you want. And then I have a list of other nonprofits that are all wildlife rehabilitators that are working in and around the Vermont area. But again, just a Google search will find a lot of these places. So when that brings me to the last one, which is your questions. So I'll tackle Emily's first, just since it just popped up in the chat, which is how do you volunteer and should we email someone? And that is pretty much it. You email someone, you find a rehabber and you just go, I want to volunteer. Here's my age. This is my experience in terms of like, what have you done before? Like if you are completely new, that's fine. Everybody has to start somewhere, but emailing them and letting them know your availability and your commitment. And if you volunteered anywhere before, putting them as references, because what they want to know is they want to know that you're going to be in it to actually do it, because it is not glamorous. I've cleaned a lot of cages. I'm very familiar with all kinds of poop, or scat, as we call it in the natural world. So it is not just playing with squirrels and, enjoying holding raptors 24/7. It's a lot of sometimes not very pleasant tasks, like cleaning cages, preparing meals. And if you're working with birds of prey, that means rodents. So there's definitely some parts that, if you're not really, and if you're only interested in it for that part, they want to make sure that you're going to be serious. But definitely emailing them is the first step. It might take a couple of emails to get that too, because they're busy. But if you're persistent, politely persistent, they usually get back to you.
and they're busy, and they're also, many of them are volunteers themselves. So it's not their primary job.
Mhm.
So you just be persistent and just keep asking to help. Before we get into the rest of the questions, I'm just going to launch a poll. We always like to get some feedback. There's 2 questions rated 1 to 5, 5 being the best. How did you like today's cafe? And how much did you learn today? So 1 is you didn't learn very much, and 5 is you learned a lot. So once we have you answer the poll, if for some reason you don't see it, you can just put your answers in the chat. We'll then get to the questions in the Q&A box. So if you have a question to ask Laura, just also make sure to get it into the Q&A box, because that's where we're going to be taking questions from here on in, not in the chat at this point. So I'm going to give it a couple more seconds for a few more people to answer the poll, because we do like everybody to respond. It is very helpful to us. And then we'll get to the final questions. All right, I'm gonna give it 10 more seconds, see if I can get the last 2 people to take the poll. And again, get your questions in the Q&A box. All right, I'm gonna close the poll. Thank you very much, everyone. And let's get to the questions. So the first question, what do you do if you see a bird of prey trying to kill a smaller bird near the ground? Would you interfere or try to save the smaller bird?
I would not interfere. That's as it's
That's nature, right? That's nature doing nature.
Yeah, it can be a little traumatizing to watch, but it is part of nature. That's them getting their food. And just like you go to the supermarket, theirs is just a little bit more interactive. um, yeah.
So Gabby wants to know, what if you find a baby bird on the street or the driveway and the bird can't fly yet, but you can't reach the nest to put it back?
So if it's in a place or an environment where it's in immediate danger, like a street or a driveway, putting it under a tree. If you can locate where the nest is, like you can see what tree it's in, putting it under that tree can help, especially if it's feathered, because then it's probably still learning to fly. So getting it out of the roadway is the most important thing. Also if you want, you can put it in a box with like a little bit of nesting material in there out under that tree, and mama bird will come down and feed it. And potentially it will be fine there until it reaches fledgling stage. So that is one way that you can do it. If it's injured, dehydrated, and really not responding, that's when you would call a wildlife rehabilitator. So yeah, great question though.
Yeah. What I think might be the final question, unless others are typing away. In your bio, we mentioned that you're working on your 2nd master's in the field naturalist program, but what was your education path?
So my education path started out as in the classics. So I was an archaeology and Latin double major. And then after that, I taught Latin, got my master's in Latin. And then I went from there to teach for a while longer, but then started volunteering. And I volunteered just because I wanted to give back to my community, but also wanted to help conserve wild animals that I loved. And then I helped out with that for a while. I was approached and asked if I wanted to try an apprenticeship, and then I signed up for that and was doing that, which just gave me more in-depth experience. And then I signed on for an internship and continued apprenticeship with Raptor Rehabilitation, learning a lot of it on the job. And then once I was a little bit more comfortable with that, I decided I was going to really pursue it more, and decided to start looking at more graduate options and kind of looking at what prerequisites I would need for most programs. So one of the things I did was I applied to a Science in the Evening program at the University of Maryland, which was science classes that were offered for people trying to do pre-med or pre-dental or just wanting to enrich themselves in the evening. And so I started taking classes in that as part of my prereq. And then I applied to UVM and was accepted. And now I've been taking a lot of classes like field botany. I took wildlife, terrestrial wildlife biology, which was a lot of behavioral and also modeling focused with a lot of different undergrads as well as graduates. So it's been a lot of learning very quickly, but it definitely doesn't mean that, you know, just because you don't start out in the sciences doesn't mean you can't end up there. So I hope that answers your question.
Great. So Wesleyan wants to know, do songbirds get poison?
They usually will get insecticides in them. So just like, because they usually eat caterpillars and other insects. And if you poison insects and then they eat the insect, then yeah, they do. So they can face poisoning just as much as birds of prey do. And sometimes even a little bit more because of that. So usually that's why I say steer clear of all those nasty chemicals, just because they can really, really mess up the food chain system for that.
Great. Shabani wants to know, what do you do if you see a snake on the ground and doesn't move when you're approaching it?
Well, it depends. They like to be on the ground, especially on pavement, because they're sunning themselves. So snakes are cold-blooded, which just means that they need to sit out into this in the sun to kind of regain that body heat, especially when it's warm out. They like to do that. So it may not move because it's sunning itself and it's kind of just like loving life at the minute. And often they won't move because you're so big. They're just hoping that you'll they're a twig and we'll ignore them because that's sometimes also their response is to not move. So them not moving when you approach them, if they're on the ground, doesn't really mean that they're in need of help. Usually it just means that they're trying to be not seen, even though you can see them, and they're trying to get warm. If it's, you know, snowing, maybe it needs your help. But usually, like if you were to touch it, then it would probably try to get away. Obviously, unless you know the snake is non-poisonous, don't touch it. But the idea is you just want to kind of leave them be unless they look obviously injured, which usually with snakes, they're pretty good. If they don't move and if after you've like poked them with a stick, then they might actually be in need of your help. And again, I do recommend just taking a stick and lightly like poking the end of their tail, and they'll move even if they're playing dead, because that's just instinct kicking in there. If it doesn't move at that point, then it probably does need your help.
So there's a question, can a wildlife rehabilitator be a full-time job? And if so, what does the pay look like? Are you gonna be having roommates the rest of your life, or can you afford your own home?
It's a very tricky question because it depends on what you're doing and who you're working for. Like there's some things where you're a wildlife rehabilitator, but you're not solo. You're working for an organization like the World Bird Conservation is one of them. Or if you're working for a much larger operation, that's when they do hire people to be rehabilitators, but usually they're more intensive on the vet and specialized. Like you'll be more likely to be hired by one of those places if you are specialized in a specific species or have a wildlife biology background. So those types of jobs where, yes, you can be a wildlife rehabilitator and work full-time and live decently off of it, they're going to be with those larger organizations, and they're going to require more of the degree up front than if you were to be doing it as a passion project or kind of just reimbursing yourself for your time and money. It's to give you an idea, the woman I interned under at Owl Moon. She's amazing, and she does what she does full time, but she is not making money off of it. She's mostly just reimbursing her costs and making a very meager salary. And it's because her husband works at a decently paying job that she's very comfortable. But that is definitely like, it's a passion project for a lot of people. But it can also be something that if you are working in a larger organization, or you're able to really pull together a group of people and do a little bit bigger operation, like city wildlife is a lot bigger, then yeah, you definitely can make more of a career out of it, and you'll live comfortably in the sense that you have a home. It's probably going to be out in the country because that's just going to be better for what you're doing. But it's, I would say most people do it for the love of it and not for the paycheck. And those that want to do it professionally are doing it after being a wildlife biologist major in college, or they're a vet or a vet tech usually.
And I'll add, we had a Science Cafe a year ago, actually, at this time last year. A friend of mine is a wildlife vet. He now teaches at the Tufts School for Veterinary Medicine, but for years he did work with mountain gorillas in Africa and with the Jane Goodall Foundation. And so, but you know, he has an undergraduate degree and then went and got his vet degree. And so there are ways to do it. So we have time for one more question that's in the chat. Gabby wants to know that there's a robin's nest in her roof gutter. Is it safe there?
I mean, more or less. It depends on, I guess, torrential rain. We've been having a pretty dry summer so far. It would take probably a bit of rain for it to be dislodged, and more than likely they're gonna be able to, by the time that happens, they might already be fledged by that point. It's not the best place for it, to be honest, but I think the risk of moving it would make it more prone to being damaged. I mean, they make nests everywhere in the weirdest of places sometimes. But yeah, just kind of let them do their thing and then hope for the best. And the parents will hopefully learn better next time.
Okay, well, we just want to say thank you so much for sharing the work that you've done in the past. And hopefully everyone now is better informed about what to do when they encounter wildlife that may seem to need assistance, but maybe you shouldn't assist, or maybe now they know what to do. Hopefully everybody who's interested might start reaching out to volunteer, because that sounds like that's how you get started, you know, start volunteering, and who knows, it might turn into your passion. So everyone, remember, this was our last Teen Science Cafe virtually for quite a while. Hopefully we will see some of you at our in-person Summer of Science. And everybody just have a wonderful summer, and thank you for joining us today. Bye, everyone.
I'm going to real quick put my